The Booths seemed to have the perfect life, until whispers of a dark obsession emerged. Behind closed doors, an unsettling fantasy grew, leading to betrayal and a chilling confrontation. What began as a curious exploration spiraled into a shocking crime, leaving everyone asking, what really happened to Duncan and Gladys? Duncan Booth, a thriving software engineer, and his wife Gladys, an acclaimed interior designer, appeared to embody the ideal couple. Their charming home, complete with a pristine lawn and iconic white picket fence, was the envy of their community, a symbol of their perfect life. However, beneath this polished exterior, a hidden turmoil was brewing. Duncan's increasing obsession with a forbidden fantasy began to unravel their carefully constructed facade, leading them down a path of destruction. What started as a mutual curiosity quickly descended into a vortex of envy, deceit, and ultimately, a deadly outcome. Their story, once a tale of love and success, would soon become a chilling narrative of unfulfilled desires and devastating consequences. Born in 1985 in Eugene, Duncan Booth exhibited a sharp intellect and a passion for computers from an early age. Encouraged by his educator parents, he began coding his own programs by high school, though he often felt socially out of place. In contrast, Gladys Astor, born in 1987 in Seattle, thrived in a wealthy, dynamic environment. The youngest of three, she was brimming with creativity, nurtured by her real estate developer parents who provided ample opportunities, including art and interior design courses. The couple married in 2009, shortly after Gladys graduated. Their wedding, set in a stunning vineyard in the Willamette Valley, promised a bright future. Duncan's career quickly ascended as he became a senior engineer, while Gladys's interior design business gained acclaim, with her work featured in top magazines. Outwardly, the Booths had it all: flourishing careers, a beautiful home, and a seemingly perfect marriage. However, as they settled into their 30s, subtle cracks began to appear in their idyllic life, hinting at the dramatic events that would soon unfold. As the Booths approached their 10th wedding anniversary, a restlessness began to creep into their relationship. The passion that had once burned so brightly had dimmed to a comfortable but sometimes monotonous glow. Duncan, always introspective, found himself increasingly drawn to online forums and discussions about alternative sexual lifestyles. It started innocently enough, a curiosity about what other couples did to spice up their love lives. But as Duncan delved deeper into these virtual communities, he became particularly fascinated by the concept of cuckolding. The idea of watching his wife with another man, of being a voyeur to her pleasure, awakened something within him. At first, Duncan kept these thoughts to himself, ashamed and confused by the intensity of his desires. He would stay up late, ostensibly working, but in reality he was consuming every piece of cuckold-related content he could find. Gladys, perceptive as ever, sensed the change in her husband. She noticed his distraction, the way his eyes would sometimes glaze over during their conversations. The increased frequency of his late nights at the computer concerned her. Gently, she probed, asking if everything was all right, if work was becoming too stressful. Finally, after weeks of internal struggle, Duncan decided to broach the subject with Gladys. One evening, over a bottle of wine, he haltingly confessed his newfound interest. He spoke of his desires, his curiosity about exploring this fantasy, all the while watching Gladys's face for signs of disgust or rejection. To his surprise and relief, Gladys didn't recoil. Instead, she listened with an open mind, asking thoughtful questions about what exactly appealed to him about this scenario. While she expressed initial reservations, she also admitted to a certain intrigue. The idea of being desired by another man, of being the center of attention, held its own allure. This conversation marked a turning point in their marriage. What had been a private fantasy for Duncan was now out in the open, a possibility to be explored together. Neither of them could have predicted the profound impact this revelation would have on their lives, or the dangerous path it would ultimately lead them down. The Booths' foray into the world of cuckolding began cautiously. They set ground rules, discussed boundaries, and agreed to take things slowly. But finding the right person to introduce into their marriage proved challenging. They wanted someone attractive and charismatic, but also discreet and respectful of their arrangement. Enter Benedict Campbell. Gladys met him at a charity art auction in downtown Portland. Tall, with piercing green eyes, Benedict exuded a magnetic charm that drew people to him. As the owner of a successful art gallery, He moved effortlessly through Portland's cultural elite, his wit and knowledge making him the center of attention at any gathering. Gladys was immediately drawn to his sophisticated aura. They spent the evening in animated conversation about emerging artists and the latest trends in interior design. When Benedict casually mentioned being unattached and open to new experiences, Gladys felt a spark of excitement. She relayed her encounter to Duncan that night, watching his eyes light up as she described Benedict. They agreed that he might be the perfect candidate for their exploration. Duncan encouraged Gladys to nurture the connection, his excitement palpable. Over the next few weeks, Gladys and Benedict met for coffee several times, ostensibly to discuss potential collaborations between his gallery and her design firm. Each time, Gladys returned home to regale Duncan with stories of their encounters, stoking the flames of his fantasy. Finally, after a particularly flirtatious meeting, Gladys decided it was time to broach the subject with Benedict. To her surprise and delight, he was intrigued by the proposition. He admitted to having participated in similar arrangements before and understood the delicacy required. With Benedict on board, the stage was set for the booths to turn fantasy into reality. Little did they know that this decision would set in motion a series of events that would irrevocably change their lives. The night of the first encounter arrived with a mix of nervous energy and excited anticipation. Duncan and Gladys had spent weeks planning every detail, from the ambient lighting in their bedroom to the bottle of expensive champagne chilling in an ice bucket. Benedict arrived at 8 p.m. sharp, looking dashing in a tailored charcoal suit. He brought with him a bouquet of exotic flowers for Gladys and a rare bottle of scotch for Duncan, a gesture that impressed them both with its thoughtfulness. The evening began in the living room with drinks and light conversation. Benedict regaled them with stories from the art world, his charisma on full display. Gladys, dressed in a slinky black dress, laughed at his jokes and touched his arm with increasing frequency. Duncan watched from his armchair, a tumbler of scotch in hand, his heart racing with every interaction between his wife and their guest. As the night progressed and the alcohol flowed, the atmosphere grew charged with sexual tension. Finally, with a meaningful look at Duncan, Gladys took Benedict by the hand and led him upstairs. In the bedroom, Duncan settled into a corner armchair as Gladys and Benedict began to kiss passionately. When Benedict and Gladys finally fell onto the bed, their bodies entwined, Duncan felt a potent mix of arousal and an unexpected twinge of jealousy. The encounter itself was intense and passionate. Duncan watched, transfixed, as his fantasy played out before his eyes. The reality was more visceral, more overwhelming than he had imagined. Afterwards, as they all lay spent and silent, Duncan felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was satisfaction, certainly. His long-held fantasy had been realized. But there was also a nagging sense of unease, a feeling that something fundamental had shifted. Benedict left shortly after, with promises to stay in touch. As Duncan and Gladys lay in bed discussing the evening's events in hushed, excited tones, neither could have predicted how this first encounter would set the stage for the tragedy to come. They had opened Pandora's box, and there would be no closing it again. Encouraged by the success of their first foray into cuckolding, they eagerly arranged more meetings with Benedict. What had started as a monthly indulgence quickly became a weekly one. Each encounter seemed to push the boundaries further, with Benedict staying longer, the sessions growing more intense and intimate. Duncan's role began to evolve as well. Gladys said in an interview that while he was initially content to watch from afar, he found himself drawn closer to the action. Sometimes he would join in, and the dynamics of power and control within their bedroom became increasingly complex. Outside of their encounters, Benedict began to integrate more into their lives. He would join them for dinner, accompany Gladys to art exhibitions, even spend weekends at their home. His charm and wit made him a delightful companion, and the Booths found themselves enjoying his company even when action wasn't on the agenda. As spring turned to summer, Duncan's initial excitement began to give way to a gnawing sense of discomfort. He started to notice small but significant changes in Gladys's behavior. She seemed distracted during their alone time, her mind elsewhere. She began to dress up more often, even on days when they had no plans with Benedict. One evening, Duncan came home early from work to find Gladys on the phone, speaking in hushed, intimate tones. When she saw him, she quickly ended the call, claiming it was just a client. But Duncan couldn't shake the feeling that she had been talking to Benedict. Duncan tried to reassert control over the situation. He suggested taking a break from their arrangement, perhaps going on a vacation, just the two of them. But Gladys seemed reluctant, always finding reasons to delay or change the subject. His work began to suffer as he spent hours analyzing every interaction, every text message, every glance between Gladys and Benedict. He started checking Gladys's phone when she wasn't looking, scrutinizing her social media activity, even contemplating following her when she went out alone. Duncan knew he was spiraling, but he felt powerless to stop it. The game he had initiated was slipping out of his control, and he was terrified of losing Gladys. As his anxiety grew, so did his determination to put an end to the situation he had created, by any means necessary. The breaking point came on a warm July evening. Duncan had planned a romantic dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with Gladys and discuss his growing concerns. He had left work early, bought her favourite wine, and spent hours preparing an elaborate meal. But as the sun began to set and the candles burned low, Gladys was nowhere to be seen. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Hours ticked by, the carefully prepared food growing cold on the table. When she finally stumbled in shortly before midnight, her hair dishevelled and lipstick smudged, Duncan's worst fears seemed confirmed. The argument that ensued was explosive. Duncan, his emotions amplified by alcohol and hours of anxious waiting, unleashed all the fears and suspicions he'd been harbouring. He accused Gladys of falling in love with Benedict, of making a fool of him, of destroying their marriage. Gladys, caught off guard and defensive, initially tried to deflect. She claimed she'd lost track of time at a client meeting, that her phone had died. But faced with Duncan's relentless questioning and the evidence of her appearance, she finally broke down and admitted she had been with Benedict. The confession hit Duncan like a physical blow. He had suspected, had feared, but hearing it confirmed shattered something inside him. In that moment, all the excitement and thrill of their arrangement went away. Gladys, tears streaming down her face, tried to explain. She loved Duncan, she insisted, but Benedict made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. She was confused, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her deepening emotions for Benedict. Duncan, his voice low and dangerous, demanded that she end things with Benedict immediately. Gladys, her own anger rising, refused. This had been Duncan's idea in the first place, she argued. He couldn't dictate her feelings or control her relationships. In the days following their confrontation, a chilling calm settled over the Booth household. Gladys and Duncan moved around each other like ghosts, barely speaking. The tension was palpable. Gladys spent most of her time out of the house, throwing herself into her work, and Duncan suspected meeting with Benedict. Duncan, for his part, retreated into a dark place within himself. He called in sick to work, spending his days in a haze of alcohol and paranoid thoughts. He scoured Gladys's computer and phone for evidence of her relationship with Benedict, meticulously documenting every text, every call, every unexplained absence. Duncan began to fantasize about confronting Benedict, about making him pay for destroying his marriage. At first, these were just harmless daydreams, a way to vent his frustration. But as the days wore on and Gladys grew more distant, these fantasies took on a darker, more violent tone. One afternoon, while Gladys was at a client meeting, Duncan found himself in their garage, holding the heavy wrench he used for home repairs. As he felt its weight in his hand, a chilling thought crossed his mind. It would be so easy to end this and eliminate the threat to his marriage once and for all. Horrified by the direction of his thoughts, Duncan dropped the wrench and fled the garage, but the seed had been planted. As he paced the house, gulping down glasses of whiskey, the idea took root and grew. By the time night fell, what had started as a fleeting, horrifying thought had crystallized into a plan. August 15th dawned hot and humid, the air heavy with the promise of an approaching storm. Duncan woke early, his head pounding from another night of heavy drinking, but his resolve unwavering. Today would be the day he confronted Benedict, the day he reclaimed control over his life and his marriage. He spent the morning in a feverish state of preparation. He showered, shaved, and dressed with meticulous care, as if preparing for an important business meeting rather than the violent confrontation he was planning. In the garage, he selected the wrench he had held days earlier, wrapping it in a towel and placing it in a nondescript gym bag. Gladys left for work around 9 a.m., barely acknowledging Duncan as she rushed out the door. As soon as she was gone, Duncan got into his car and drove to Benedict's gallery. He parked across the street, watching as Benedict arrived, greeting his employees with his characteristic charm. For hours, Duncan sat in his car. As closing time approached, Duncan watched Benedict bid goodbye to his last customer and begin closing up the gallery. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With shaking hands, he grabbed the gym bag and crossed the street. Benedict was locking the gallery door when Duncan approached. He turned, surprise flickering across his face before it settled into a wary smile. "Duncan," he said, "this is unexpected. Is everything all right?" Duncan felt a surge of rage at Benedict's casual tone, as if he hadn't been destroying Duncan's life for months. Without conscious thought, he swung the gym bag, catching Benedict off guard and sending him stumbling back against the gallery door. What followed was a blur of violence and desperation. Duncan pulled out the wrench, swinging it wildly as Benedict tried to defend himself. But Duncan was beyond reason. Every blow was fueled by months of jealousy, insecurity, and rage. When it was over, Duncan stood panting over Benedict's motionless body, the wrench slick with blood in his trembling hand. The reality of what he had done crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had just killed a man. He had just destroyed his own life in a futile attempt to save it. Duncan went through the motions of covering his tracks. He dragged Benedict's body into the alley behind the gallery, hiding it behind a dumpster. He wiped down the door handle and any surfaces he might have touched. Then, still in a state of shock, he drove home, the weight of his actions settling over him like a shroud. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke as Duncan pulled into his driveway, the rain washing away the blood on his hands but doing nothing to cleanse his conscience. In the hours after the murder, Duncan was lost in a haze of disbelief and horror. He stumbled into his home, barely making it to the bathroom before retching violently. As the adrenaline faded, the gravity of his actions crushed him. He had taken a life. On autopilot, he methodically erased the evidence, burning his blood-stained clothes in the backyard fire pit, meticulously cleaning his car, and scrubbing himself clean in the shower. When Gladys returned, Duncan had composed himself just enough to act normal. He greeted her with a strained smile, suggesting they order takeout and watch a movie. As they sat on the couch, the TV flickering in the background, Duncan's mind was racing. He knew it was only a matter of time before Benedict's body was found. He needed an alibi, a believable story to explain his day. Casually, he told Gladys he'd been at home all day, catching up on work and tending to the yard. He even pointed out a small cut on his hand, claiming it was from pruning rose bushes, an injury that had actually occurred during his struggle with Benedict. 2 days later, the news broke. Benedict Campbell, a well-known art dealer and prominent figure in Portland's cultural scene, had been discovered dead behind his gallery. The police quickly labeled it a homicide. Duncan heard the shocking news at work, overhearing colleagues talk about the tragedy. His reaction was visceral. He felt the blood drain from his face, his hands trembling so violently he had to excuse himself to the restroom, where the enormity of his crime threatened to overwhelm him. The investigation moved quickly. Detective Maris Kelly, a veteran of the Police Bureau's Homicide Division, took charge of the case. She and her team combed through Benedict's life, interviewing friends, family, and business associates. It didn't take long for them to uncover Benedict's relationship with the Booths. Gladys, devastated by the news of Benedict's death, initially tried to downplay their connection, but faced with evidence from Benedict's phone records and witness accounts, she eventually admitted to their affair. When the police came to interview Duncan, he was prepared. He expressed shock and sadness at Benedict's death, acknowledging that while their arrangement had been unconventional, he had considered Benedict a friend. He calmly recounted his movements on the day of the murder, his story aligning perfectly with what he had told Gladys. Detective Kelly, however, sensed something off about Duncan's demeanor. His calm seemed forced, his grief a touch too performative. She made a mental note to dig deeper into his background and movements. As the investigation progressed, the police began to piece together a timeline of Benedict's last day. Security footage from nearby businesses showed him entering the gallery in the morning but never leaving. His last phone call had been to Gladys, ending abruptly around closing time. The net was slowly closing around Duncan. As the days turned into weeks, Gladys's grief over Benedict's death deepened. She threw herself into her work, often staying late at the office, avoiding the stilted silences that now characterized her home life with Duncan. At first, Duncan's attentiveness in the wake of the tragedy had touched her. He seemed genuinely concerned for her well-being, always ready with a comforting word or a shoulder to cry on. But as time passed, she began to notice inconsistencies in his behavior. Gladys found herself revisiting the events leading up to Benedict's death. She remembered Duncan's jealousy, his desperate pleas for her to end the affair. The more she thought about it, the more a terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. She started paying closer attention to Duncan's actions, noting when he left the house, checking his browser history when he wasn't around. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but couldn't bring herself to take that final step. As her suspicions grew, so did her fear. If Duncan was capable of what she was beginning to suspect, what else might he be capable of? For the first time in their marriage, Gladys found herself afraid of her husband, unsure of the man she had promised to love for better or worse. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A homeless man known to frequent the alley behind Benedict's gallery came forward with information. He claimed to have seen a man matching Duncan's description entering the alley on the night of the murder, carrying a gym bag. This new lead energized the investigation. Detective Kelly and her team began to scrutinize Duncan's movements more closely. They discovered traffic camera footage that contradicted his alibi, showing his car near the gallery around the time of the murder. As the evidence mounted, Duncan's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started drinking heavily, snapping at colleagues, and becoming paranoid about being followed. Gladys, her own suspicions now seemingly confirmed, began to distance herself from him, staying with a friend under the guise of needing space to grieve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the police, armed with a search warrant, found small traces of blood in Duncan's car that matched Benedict's DNA. They also discovered the murder weapon, the blood-stained wrench that Duncan had hidden in the attic, unable to bring himself to dispose of it completely. On a rainy September morning, nearly a month after Benedict's death, Detective Kelly arrived at the Booth residence with a team of officers. They found Duncan sitting in the living room, a half-empty bottle of whiskey beside him. As the detective read him his rights, Duncan offered no resistance. In that moment he felt an odd sense of relief. The game was over. The lies, the fear, the constant vigilance, it could all stop now. Duncan Booth's trial was brief but sensational. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, his confession a rambling account of jealousy, fantasy, and fatal obsession. He was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Gladys, shattered by the revelation of her husband's actions, filed for divorce shortly after his arrest. She sold their house, unable to live with the memories it held, and moved out of state to start a new life. The tragic story from the case in the video serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of unchecked emotions and hidden desires. It teaches us the importance of open communication in relationships and the dangers of letting fantasies spiral into dangerous actions. The case also highlights the need for seeking help when struggling with difficult feelings, rather than resorting to harmful behavior. Ultimately, it underscores the value of honesty, trust, and self-awareness in maintaining healthy relationships and personal integrity. The choices we make, driven by emotions, can have irreversible impacts on our lives and those around us. Hey, interested in more real-life murder mysteries? Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Do you have any thoughts about this case or have a case of your own you'd like us to investigate? Leave us a comment. Thanks for watching video.